Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Janet Anderson and I'm the Commissioner of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present and indeed emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us in the webinar today. Today we're going to be talking about the Serious Incident Response Scheme, or SIRS as we call it, with a focus on incident management systems. Now, this is the first of 3 webinars we'll be hosting to help the home services sector to prepare for implementation. Why are we talking about SIRS in home services? Well, an act has recently been passed through Parliament which introduces SIRS in home services from the 1st of December. Now, a number of you would be familiar with SIRS because it actually was introduced in residential aged care on the 1st of April 2021. When I say SIRS in home services, what does that actually encompass? Home services providers include providers of home care packages, Commonwealth Home Support Program services, and flexible care services delivered in a home or community setting. Now, not all the details about SIRS, as it will apply to home services, are available yet. The government will be releasing an exposure draft of what it calls subordinate legislation very shortly, and that is the legislation which sits under the Act and sets out far more of the details and the rules that will apply to providers. So in today's webinar, what we're going to do is to focus on your development and embedding of an effective incident management system. And I'm joined by 3 panel members to step you through this topic. The first is Anne Wunsch, who's an Executive Director in the Commission, and she's going to be talking about what is an incident management system, why it's important. The second speaker is Dr. Melanie Roth, who is the Chief Clinical Advisor in the Commission, and Melanie will talk about the clinical management of incidents. And then the panelists are rounded out by Anthony Speed, another Executive Director in the Commission, who will be talking about IMS, Incident Management System, compliance and insights from the home services sector. Now, earlier today, we sent out a handout to all of you who had pre-registered for today's webinar, and I hope you've received it. If you didn't receive the handout, we certainly will publish it on our website, and we can provide a link for you in the course of or immediately after this webinar. I certainly encourage you to, if you have it, to keep an eye on it as we move through today's webinar, because the panel members are likely to make reference to it. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions before the webinar. We have a large number of them, so clearly that speaks to your strong interest in the topic. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and any we don't get to will be addressed through a Q&A sheet that we'll publish on our website and that we'll keep updating as we get more questions that we can answer for you. And of course, I do encourage you also to submit questions as we go through today's webinar. You know how to do it using the chat function. Shoot them through, and I'll get to as many of them as I can with the panel when we get to the Q&A section of the webinar. But before we start, I want to actually start with a poll, a pre-poll. And I'm going to ask you to respond to a quick poll question which tells us in a snapshot way what you understand now about incident management systems. And there are 4 possible answers: very well, well, to some extent, or very little. And it's anonymous, so go for broke. Let us know what your current level of understanding is of IMSs, incident management systems. Do you understand them very well? Do you understand them well? Do you understand them to some extent, or very little? I'll just give you a moment to pop your answers in your browser there, and the numbers hopefully will come through to me. And this is a sort of a pre-test because we want to know where we're starting with you. How many of you are familiar with IMSs? How many of you are very comfortable that you have the right settings in your service? And how many of you might be thinking, actually, I don't know enough about this and I'm really keen to learn more. All right, unsurprisingly, we have around 9% of you who've responded very little. The biggest number of you, the largest number, 36%, have responded to some extent. Then we have 33%, 32% who've responded well, and 22% of you, around 1/5 of you, who've responded very well. That's great, because we've got well and very well are over half of all of the webinar participants. That, frankly, is very reassuring. So let's see how we go through the next 55 minutes or so. Let me invite Anne Woods to take the stage, as it were, and Anne's going to talk to us about incident management systems. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Janet. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning. We know that's a very good place to start. What's an incident? An incident is an act or it's an omission, that is something that hasn't happened, an event or a circumstance that occurs or is suspected to have occurred. Now, suspected to have occurred means that you have a reasonable belief that an incident has occurred, or alleged to have occurred, which means somebody has said an incident has occurred. So it has been, the incident has been referred to in a conversation or in writing. And the specific subset of incidents that we're talking about here today are those that are in connection with the provision of care or services. Now, you would know in the delivery of home care, you would come into contact with circumstances in the care of an individual where an incident may occur that is not connected with the provision of care or services, but you become aware of it, and your incident management system still needs to have some reference to this incident, as that incident may impact on the way you deliver care or services to the person. The second aspect of an incident, and don't worry about taking notes because this information will be in the handout in the slides that you receive. The second aspect that's really important is that it could have been reasonably expected to have caused harm to a consumer or another person. So the subset is of incidents that are in connection with the provision of care and services and could have reasonably be expected to have caused harm to a consumer or another person. Now, this could have reasonably been expected to have caused is a concept that you will need to come to grips with. It means that this particular event, incident, omission or act would ordinarily cause physical or psychological injury or discomfort that requires medical or psychological treatment to resolve. You don't need to confirm that this occurred. You need to understand whether it could reasonably have been expected to have caused this harm. So serious incidents that are reportable under SIRS are in effect a subset of all the incidents that you currently should document in your IMS. And this is because you're required to do so under the aged care quality standards. So your IMS should include the totality of incidents, and within that, there are a subset that are serious and in connection with the provision of care and services, and they are the matters that are reportable under SIRS. Now, when you go away afterwards and take a look at your handout, you'll see a slide that has a large circle, and that circle is coloured crimson, magenta, maybe fuchsia. It's pink. That's the totality of your incidents. Within that, you'll see a smaller purple circle, and that circle are the matters that you'll report to the Commission under SIRS, Priority 1 and Priority 2. And within the purple circle, there's a smaller circle, it's blue, electric blue, and it is the Priority 1 incidents. And if you think about your system as reflecting incidents in this way, then you'll be able to determine which are the ones that are reportable under the Serious Incident Response Scheme. Now, if I just move on to why have an incident management system. Now, clearly the system enables you to identify, assess and manage and resolve incidents. It assists you to review and learn from incidents to reduce risk and prevent them from occurring again. And over time, your incident management should support improvement in the safety and quality of services that you're providing. And that is because you will apply analysis to the incidents that you're reporting, and you will start to understand, as you report to the Commission, trends in your own incidents, and those trends should enable you to determine appropriate responses that could in effect and should reduce the likelihood that these incidents would occur to the individual or to others. I'll just move on now to what's included in an incident management system. Now, there are 4 key components. The first is the framework, that is the policies and the procedures for incident management. What is recorded? When is it recorded? How is it recorded? Who is responsible for reporting, recording, etc. And you would, of course, need to have the second component, which is a tool, a recording tool to capture this information. The third critical component is staff training and reminders. That is, your staff need to know how to use your IMS. You would need to have a staff training program that takes into account staff turnover, staff development needs, and particularly if staff are only working for you on an infrequent basis, how would you ensure that they remain skilled and able to use a system that they may not need to use frequently? The last part is really critical, and it's for the organisation as a whole, and that is your governance framework. The accountabilities and operations need to be regularly reviewed. This includes how you manage reporting when you as the approved provider deliver services through subcontracted providers. And just on that last point, we know of circumstances where some approved providers subcontract services, and in other instances, they are also the subcontractor for another approved provider. So how will your system reflect the accountability you have in instances where you're the subcontractor to a provider and where you're the approved provider managing care through a subcontractor? We expect that systems will look different according to the size and scale of your organisation. Some will be computerised, some will be paper-based, and you need to ensure that you have a system that is effective for the operation that you manage. Now, best practice responses by providers should reflect the elements that you will see on slide 6, that is page 6 of the handout we've sent through. There are 6 elements to a best practice response to an incident, and I just want to highlight 2 of them because that's what we've learned since we've implemented SIRS in residential aged care, and that is the analysis of the incident at element 4 and the closing the loop at 6 are critical parts of a system that may not always get the relevant attention that they should. Analysis is critical when you're reporting multiple incidents of a similar type. The Commission wants to understand, how do you extract themes, issues that underlie the incidents, and how do you ensure that the relevant stakeholders are engaged in relation to your incident management system, that you've used open disclosure to discuss the incident with the consumer or their representative, and that you've educated staff to change care practices to reduce the likelihood that incidents will reoccur. So when you go and look at these slides at the end of our session today, please focus on the aspects that you think are the ones that you need to really develop and embed in your own organisation. And just note that analysis and closing the loop are two parts of a best practice response that would probably be appropriately focused on. Now, I talked to you about how to identify the subset of incidents that are relevantly reported under SIRS. We know that you would already have networks within your organisation and outside your organisation that would assist you to engage with the appropriate authorities in relation to incidents that occur or that you become aware of when you're delivering care. And these incidents may not be ones that involve your organisation or your staff, but still they are ones that would impact and potentially cause harm to consumers. So think about the way that you currently respond to these incidents. How do you evidence best practice in relation to those incidents? How do you use relevant networks? For instance, your engagement with domestic violence services or sexual assault services or the police, elder abuse organisations, children's services. What does your engagement piece look like in relation to those organisations, and how do you liaise with them in relation to incidents that you become aware of through the care that you deliver? You may still need to maintain those relationships in the context of some of the SIRS notices, SIRS incidents that you understand through your delivery of care. The relevance of sexual assault services, of engagement with the police is very much front and centre to reporting serious incidents under SIRS. So you will want to leverage off your existing relationships or build those relationships that are key to effectively managing the serious incidents that are the subject of our serious incident response scheme. Now, there are two resources that we have created to support you here. The first one that I'm going to raise with you is the What is an Effective Incident Management System Serious Incident Response Scheme fact sheet. It's a short read. I suggest you go to it first because it's got a checklist that will help you identify the requirements that are relevant to an incident management system. You can use the fact sheet to work through whether your system has these elements. If you identify elements that you're not confident that your system has, then you should go to our Effective Incident Management Systems Best Practice Guidance document and it will assist you to develop and embed best practice in your IMS. Thank you, and I'll pass back now to you, Janet.
Great. Wonderful, Anne. Thank you so much. There's a lot of fairly specific content that you just covered there, and we may come back to some of it in the Q&A session. Just while I have the floor, mention again that this is the first of 3 webinars. The second is going to be on SIRS reportable incidents, and we are planning to hold that on Monday, the 10th of October. And the third in the series is going to be reporting under SIRS, which will be on Monday, the 17th of October. Now, we're going to open registrations for each of those subsequent 2 webinars a week before the event. So please keep your eye out on our webpage for notification of those so that you can sign up. Keep your questions coming in, please, as we move through the webinar. And let me now introduce Dr. Melanie Roth, Chief Clinical Advisor in the Commission. And Melanie's going to talk about clinical management of incidents. Thanks, Melanie.
Thanks very much. Yes, I'm going to talk about clinical management, I guess, or management of clinical incidents, which is not quite the same. But clinical incidents occur in all settings where healthcare or related care is delivered. So that includes hospitals, disability homes, aged care settings, and of course in the community. Many clinical incidents result in harm, but many others could have resulted in harm. And I think it's just really important to de-link the outcome to some extent, because near misses, as they're called, that's incidents that could have resulted in harm, or incidents that you were able to avert. In a sense, you could see it coming and you prevented it. Those are your friend. Those are your really, really good friend. And if you ignore the near misses because they didn't result in harm, then you'll be waiting until they did. So if you have 5 incidents and the 5th one resulted in harm, then you had 4 previous missed opportunities to avoid the one that did result in harm. So make sure that your incident management system doesn't just look at harm, it's got to look at incidents. They're extremely useful in what can be learned from them about risks. So all incidents are learning opportunities. And if the same incidents are happening again and again, there's something wrong with your system in some way. So the goal obviously is to minimise the risk of an incident occurring and to reduce the risk of an incident occurring again. And this involves a whole lot of steps really. Understanding the causes of incidents and risks will allow staff to predict and avert them. So you actually have to start looking at what the causes and contributors were. So collecting the information is really important. Information is power. The more information you've got about an incident, the more likely you are to be able to respond to it in a way that reduces the chance of it happening again. And data is really important because that, as Anne has said, allows you to look at the trends. If you've got the slide pack, then I'm really going through some of the items on the colourful circle, which is slide 6. But data will allow you, if you as a provider suddenly realise that you're having a rash of incidents in a certain category, well, obviously you would be jumping to look at why that might be. And you would very much like to see that data showing you that you're improving it. So when nothing changes, everything's likely to keep happening. And you must look at incidents really as a crucial opportunity to change, to improve, and to reduce the risks to the person themselves or others. So ask yourself the following when an incident occurs. How could this have happened? What went wrong? Could it happen again to this person, or could the same thing happen to other people? And how can we minimise the risk? Once you start doing it as a routine, it becomes actually automatic. It's quite a good way of looking at it. So trying to understand all of the possible causes is item 4 on that slide, which is really analyse the incident. I'm going to give you an example because not all similar incidents will have the same precipitating cause, and many will have multiple contributors. So thinking you found the cause may may stop you looking further and finding other potential contributors that you can modify. And the modifications really need to be specific to the cause. So look at what it is. Is it education? Is it processes? Is it policies? Is it handover? Is it oversight and monitoring? And then, of course, close that loop by checking that the changes that you think you've put in place have actually occurred and are going to be sustained. You've got to review the whole system periodically to confirm that the new arrangements remain fit for purpose. And you've got to continue to detect new issues as early as possible. So opportunities there are when you've got new clients who may have risks that you haven't thought about before, new staff, new pandemics. Let's hope that we've seen the last of those for a little while, etc. So when things change, you need to re-examine the risks. And I'm just going to finish really with a case study. And as I go through this, I'd like you to really start thinking about, if this was the case, what are the things that I'm talking about that as part of an incident management system could be changed to avoid this happening to the same person or to other people. So this is a case study of a fall with a fracture. And the response might be, well, that's a shame. What a stroke of bad luck. Poor you. I'm so sorry. Now, if you leave it at that, that's a lovely sympathetic response, but that is not an incident management. The next step, the first step is to make sure that the person's all right and that the immediate incident has been dealt with, and we'll go through that. But you've also got to be looking at all the potential contributors you can identify. So this is a gentleman who's fallen in his home, and there's a carer in the home with him. The carer's making the bed, and the man was watching television. The fall occurs in the bathroom. So you're looking at the potential contributors, and you identify that this man's got mild dementia, he's got poor judgment, and he's quite impulsive. He's unaware of his own limitations, and he forgets that he needs his walking frame to walk with unless it's in his sight. The light in the TV room is poor. His slippers are too big. He's got a bandaged shin, which was noted to be loose and trailing. He wasn't wearing his glasses. His blood pressure's been documented to be a little bit low recently, and he's also recently started on a new medication, and he was a little bit more confused than normal today. He missed his breakfast. He's got a blood sugar which might possibly be low since he missed his breakfast and he's on diabetic medications. He's normally a bit unsteady, and he normally has a frame or assistance. And when he fell, he'd gone to the bathroom and had not been using his walking aid. His frame had been out of sight. Now, the carer wasn't able to see him because she was making the bed. She wasn't able to hear him calling out for help because his TV was on quite loudly. When she went in to find him, the floor in the bathroom was wet. There was a towel on the floor. The bathroom has no rails. And he appeared to be trying to hurriedly undress while he was walking. So he had clothing around his legs. And he had fallen before. So when people asked what was he trying to do, he was actually trying to rush to the toilet. He wasn't somebody that was able anymore to remember that, to recognise that he needed to go and to head off early. He really waited until he was desperate, and it was a last minute thing. And when he called out, he rushed himself to the toilet because nobody came to help him. So how could this have been predicted? There are many things that would have been warning signs. He could have been kept in the line of sight. He could have had a regular toileting. We would have known he was due to go soon, so let's predict that. Now, I told you that it was a fall with fracture, but this gentleman actually didn't have a fracture. He was on the floor. He might have had a fracture. He might have had a head injury. It was an unwitnessed fall, so nobody knew. But he was quite distressed and upset about the fall. He was crying, in fact. But the new carer, who didn't really know him and had only just started the job, was really upset that this had happened on her watch. She was panicky. She hadn't been instructed how to get help in various situations, and she had forgotten things that you might think you would remember, but if you're in a panic, you don't. she hadn't been handed over any information on his particular risks and the things to watch out for. She didn't initially think of calling her supervisor or an ambulance. So she tried to get him up. He was a large man, and she was as I said, she was in a panic, and it was she who was injured, getting him off the floor without help. She sustained a crush fracture, and she's now off work for a significant amount of time. So I think that really shows how looking at one thing and responding to one thing is not going to manage the risks of this sort of thing happening again. There are so many things there that could have been done differently. We don't really know what was the dominant contributor, but clearly it was likely to be more than one. So if you go around the wheel and look at all of the things, it's now obvious how you can implement actions to prevent this particular fall happening again. But there are many things in relation to governance and handover and information and education as well. So I think I'll just leave it at that as a real life example.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. Lots of questions coming in, and we'll get to those after we've completed the panel sessions. Just before I introduce Anthony, we are looking also for feedback directly from you at the end of the webinar to assist us in doing our best work in giving you what you need and making sure that these webinars are fit for purpose. So you can actually answer that survey at any point by clicking on the yellow speech bubble icon at the top of your screen. But you might want to leave a bit more time to allow us to get to the end of the presentations and into the Q&A session, and then possibly complete that survey to give us your feedback on how this has been for you and where we might seek to improve. Now, over to Anthony. Anthony is an Executive Director in the Commission, and Anthony's going to talk to us about compliance with the requirements to have an incident management system and some insights that we as a regulator have developed about home services in relation to Standard 8. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you, Commissioner. And as we've heard, there are 4 key essential elements to an incident management system, and those key elements are included in the handout. So I'd encourage you to refer to those. But briefly, they are around ensuring that you have those policies and procedures in place for incident management that Anne talked to, that you have those recording tools available to capture the information, that you have the staff training and reminders in place so staff are able to know where to go to use the IMS and how to use it. And most importantly, as Anne referred to in terms of that wheel that's described in the handout, that there's a governance framework. There are accountabilities and operations are in place and are regularly reviewed to support an effective incident management system. I'll talk a little bit about the quality standards and in particular Standard 8 in a moment. But before I do, we know that there are a number of providers of aged care in-home services who are already providers of disability support services. So a number of you will already be familiar with the reporting requirements to the NDIS Commission where incidents have occurred. And whilst some of the details of the scheme's operation in aged care home services are still under development and will be available to you shortly, we do know that the reporting requirements in aged care are quite similar to those for NDIS providers. So, for example, both commissions will require you to provide certain reports within 24 hours of you becoming aware of the incident. And both commissions will require further information to be provided within 5 days of making your initial report. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the SIRS provisions and requirements, they have been developed within a familiar framework, which is the responsibilities that you as a provider have under the Aged Care Act and the Quality of Care Principles. And those principles in particular outline what you must do to identify incidents, to respond to those incidents and to assess the incidents, with a focus on identifying the causal factors, on implementing a preventative approach to mitigate those from occurring in the future, and most importantly, on that analysis and understanding what the continuous improvement lesson that you may learn from that brings to your organisation. So when you're reporting serious incidents to the Commission under SIRS, we look for and want to be assured that this is what you have done, that you're in the process of doing this. And we recognise that you may not have all the relevant information when making an initial notification. But what we would like to see in the initial notification is that you've responded to an incident and can outline your next set of activities. And we would then like you to follow that up with further advice to the Commission to outline your activities and the effectiveness of those. And this demonstrates to us that there is a clear focus on you acting on the incidents that may cause harm to aged care recipients. As mentioned by Anne, the Commission will assess notifications, will form a view, and will consider how you are meeting your obligations under the quality of care principles and the quality standards in general. Where the Commission has concerns that you haven't, and there are ongoing risks to aged care recipients that have been identified, the matter may be escalated to a Commission investigations team. And that team may attend your offices, may speak to your staff, may speak to aged care recipients and other services to determine whether you as the approved provider are meeting your responsibilities under the Act and the principles. We may identify non-compliance in some cases, and if that's the case, the Commission may take further action, and we may that action may include issuing a compliance notice, for example, which requires you to undertake certain activities to mitigate those risks. Quality standard number 8 is a critical standard. All of them are. Quality standard number 8, I draw your particular attention to in this context. The standard is measured through a program of quality audits and assessment contacts for home services. And the second most common area of non-compliance we find in this program are those requirements under Standard 8, organisational governance. And that standard requires approved providers to demonstrate that there is a culture of safe, inclusive, quality care, that there are governance systems in place to promote that culture, and that there are effective risk management systems in place to manage high risks, including managing and preventing incidents. And we'll continue to monitor approved providers under that standard in relation to incident management systems. So getting your IMS right will go a long way to reducing levels of non-compliance with Standard 8. The wheel that's in the handout that Anne took us through has those 6 critical steps to managing incidents, and those 4 points that I made at the outset are critical, and I'd encourage you to look at the handout to review that. It's also important to know that where a person makes a disclosure of an incident that may be a reportable incident, that person should not suffer any detriment because of that disclosure. I expect there will be strong provisions around dealing with victimisation, and persons covered by those provisions may include staff, key personnel, volunteers, and care recipients themselves. Therefore, ensuring that your staff are well trained on using the IMS is absolutely critical. It's also really important that you are open with aged care recipients and their representatives about how you manage incidents, and you can demonstrate that in your contact with the Commission. I'll now hand back to the Commissioner. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Good work. Okay, we have about 15 or so minutes for some really good questions that you have been forwarding to us in the course of the webinar. Thank you very much for all those who've submitted. And I suspect a number of these are for you, but let me just preface it by seeing if I have grabbed the essence of the presentation. Not all incidents are serious incidents. Every provider of home services is expected to have an incident management system now. An incident management system doesn't have to be really sophisticated, but it must be a system. It must be more than something which is ad hoc. And that incident management systems are really important as a tool for continuous improvement to reduce the risk of harm to consumers. A provider can be found non-compliant, Anthony, this is your point, against Quality Standard 8 if the provider doesn't have an incident management system. So that's an incentive to pay attention to this. and that there are lots of resources available, Anthony, also your point, on our website to assist and support providers in building and enhancing the incident management system. Now, Anne, let me come to some particular questions. Some people have asked, well, what are the reportable incidents? They want that detail, and of course they do. My understanding is that will be in the subordinate legislation, the more detailed legislative instrument, which is not yet available. Do we have any indication as to when we're likely to be able to get to see that?
Shortly. Sorry, that's a very non-specific answer, but we do believe that we're very close to having that available. So I would expect it very soon. For those on the webinar who also deliver residential aged care as well as home services, you'll be very familiar with the 8 categories, the 8 notification types, and you would be able to see how they would apply in a home service setting. I know that some people are asking us a question about CHSP and how could the scheme apply to a CHSP service. Well, we know that it's quite common for the same types of services to be delivered under home care package arrangements as are delivered under CHSP, for instance, showering or personal care. We also know that transport services do involve potential risks associated with the way that service is delivered. And so there are opportunities for you to reflect on the current scheme that applies to residential aged care and think through what could be potentially the incidents that occur in the service types that you operate, that you currently record in your incident management system that are reportable from 1 December under SIRS. You also will need to continue, as I mentioned earlier, to think about those incidents that aren't reportable under SIRS but still create risk and harm for consumers, and think through how you currently manage those incidents or engage with other providers to assist consumers who are subject to harm through those incidents that aren't reportable under SIRS.
Okay, staying with you, Anne, we've had a couple of people who deliver Meals on Wheels as a CHSP service, and they've asked a very reasonable question. How does SIRS relate to the work that they do?
So in your engagement with a consumer through a Meals on Wheels service, you develop a relationship with that individual. You are aware of how that individual engages or doesn't engage with you. You have brief contact that potentially would alert you to concerns about that individual. And as the potentially that's the only contact that individual has with an outside service, you are also conscious of the responsibility and accountability that your service has in that person's life. So you still need to have a system that would support appropriate reporting by that consumer to your service about some aspect of the way that service was delivered to them, or by the staff member who or volunteer who is involved in that service, who would be talking to you about any concern about the way the service was managed, or an omission in relation to that service, that the service wasn't delivered. That potentially could be a serious incident. So that incident type that engagement through a Meals on Wheels service is in scope for the Serious Incident Response Scheme. And the induction and the training and support that you provide to your staff and volunteers who assist in the delivery of that service should include information about their accountabilities under the Serious Incident Response Scheme and your obligations as a provider. Now, we're going to develop a resource that will assist you have that engagement with staff and with volunteers, so they can share the resource also with the consumer that they work with, so each party can understand the consumer's rights and under the service that they're being provided, and the provider and the staff members' responsibilities and accountabilities to provide that service and respond through effectively through a serious incident response scheme.
Thank you, Anne. Melanie, one for you. You mentioned this notion of potential harm. So actual or potential harm, and I think you used the language of near miss. Can you just give us a couple more sentences about that? Because you talked about it as being your friend. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so potential harm in the sense of a near miss is when an incident happens or almost happens, where you go, phew, that's lucky that she didn't fully fall down, she landed in the chair, lucky that he didn't fracture anything. I can give an example of medications that are left within reach of somebody who no longer understands what they're meant to be taking. And when you come back the next day and you realise what you've done, you're very, very frightened to notice whether they've taken them all or whether in fact they've taken none. Now, if they've taken them all, that's an incident. If they haven't taken them all, then that's still an incident, but it was with potential harm. So that could have resulted in harm to that person. They could have taken them all. So that's one sense of potential harm. That's the could have resulted in harm. And you just need to look at things and say, well, was that just a very minor thing? Or was that something that we're just lucky it wasn't a major thing? So when you're lucky, that's when it's your friend, because that gives you the chance to change things. But the other sense of potential harm is actually when you don't initially recognise the harm. The harm isn't obvious, but it's still possibly there. So that goes to monitoring a person afterwards. So that's where there may be delayed internal bleeding, or where somebody's terribly stiff and in pain the next day after a major fall, or where somebody was so frightened by what happened that it's done severe psychological harm to them, or where somebody with cognitive impairment is unable to tell you what happened. They're either unable to remember or they're unable to tell you, and yet you can imagine that at the time they very likely were in pain. It's just that they can't remember it to tell you now. So there are two components to potential harm, but a near miss is when an incident happens and or almost happened and did not result in harm, luckily this time.
So learning opportunity fundamentally.
Yes.
Okay. And another one back to you. What about incidents, and there would be a number of them, that happen when the worker is not there? Do they fall within scope of incidents for logging and reporting, potentially?
Out where we talk about an incident as being an act or an omission or an event or a circumstance in the context of the delivery of care. If you are unsure about in scope for the Serious Incident Response Scheme, then please call us, and we have a 1-800 number for you to contact us to discuss incidents, to assist you in building your confidence around engaging with this program. Providers, we know, sometimes will report in case it's reportable, because you're trying to do the right thing. We'll help you and give you feedback in circumstances where the incident is not in scope for SIRS. But of course, we're also keen to understand from you how you would routinely manage these incidents through your incident management system, as that is important in relation to your role in protecting consumers.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, there's a question that's come through for you, and it has to do with your brief overview of where we find non-compliance with Standard 8. And the question goes along the lines of how do we work with those providers who are found non-compliant to assist them to understand their obligations and to address the non-compliance?
Thanks, Janet. We work with providers through a number of means. As a risk-based regulator, we have a pyramid approach, and at the very base level, we provide engagement tools and guidance and resources and events such as today's. Moving through analysis of the sector, and we publish sector performance reports on our website, which gives you some insight into the sector. And then importantly, we undertake monitoring contacts. Many of you may have received phone calls from us in relation to, for example, adverse weather events. But our quality audit program and our performance assessments, where we find non-compliance, we will refer that to our compliance and enforcement colleagues for a response. So it may be that a decision is made, for example, in particularly high-risk cases, to require a notice of intent to require a on-site advice through a nurse advisor, for example, in some cases. Or more commonly, we may issue a notice of non-compliance requiring a provider to take particular actions. And we will always look for how a provider has responded to a finding of non-compliance in our follow-up visit or our follow-up contact with that provider. So we will look to learn from continuous improvement and what a provider has learned from a finding of non-compliance. And again, I'd refer you to some of those resources that are indicated in the handout. Best practice guidance for incident management systems is one of them, but we also have fact sheets. And in home services, we also recently published some risk checklists for providers to use, particularly around Standard 8. So that self-assurance is a feature of how compliance is managed by a provider at a service level, as well as working with us and us working with a provider to support continuing good practice.
Okay, thank you. And here's an interesting one. Somebody has asked about consent. There may be a circumstance from time to time where the consumer who's been the subject of some action or inaction is reluctant for that to be known, and if they were aware that it is the subject of reporting, may actually request that it's not reported. Is there a setting on this that you can offer as guidance to providers online here?
Yes, I can. It's important that the incident is reported regardless of whether the individual has asked that it is not reported. It's your obligation and your accountability as an approved provider here. Now, you still have that important conversation to have with the consumer and or their representative about why you needed to do that. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that we're developing a resource which will be a very short video, an animation that you can watch together with the consumer and or their representative to explain how the Serious Incident Response Scheme works. We'll include something in that will help you have the conversation about the consent issue. Consent or lack of consent should not be used as a threshold for determining whether you report. All incidents that are within the scheme should be reported and must be reported, but you will need to continue to engage with that consumer. Even if you've had to report something, they would have preferred you didn't. So you will need to have the skills and the sensitivity in your approach with them about why you did it and what you need to do to protect them and also discuss with them the aspects of open disclosure relevant to that particular incident, so that they understand that that is part of your role as a service provider to them, and that's their accountability to in relation to the legislation, the framework in which they operate as a provider, their accountability to the Australian public. They are a funded, Australian government funded service, and it's important that they administer the service in a way that is consistent with their obligations.
Okay. You've mentioned open disclosure a couple of times, and I think it's also useful to refer people on this webinar to a resource that's available on our website, specifically in relation to open disclosure. It is a provision within the quality standards, and we became aware fairly early on in the implementation of the standards that this was not a familiar concept to a number of providers. So we have published on this, and I commend that document to you. We can certainly provide a link to it afterwards if you are at all unfamiliar with what that means and what it requires of you, but also the benefits of doing it in a timely way, where you are reaching out to the consumer who may have been impacting and talking them through the steps that you as a provider are taking to minimise the impact of the incident on them as far as that you're able to, but also to do the analysis, which means you are reducing the risk of any recurrence of that incident for that individual and indeed for other individuals receiving similar services. So it's a vital component of that continuous improvement loop that we've spoken about a couple of times. Now, I'm conscious of time. Let me move through to the end of the webinar. But before we do that, I want to take another poll. So up on your screen now, we'll have a second quick poll, same set of questions. How well do you understand the incident management systems now after today's webinar? 4 possible answers: very well, well, to some extent, or very little. So pop your answer in there quickly, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll just have a quick look at how these numbers have shifted compared to our opening poll. And I am delighted to announce, and the numbers are building quickly. Okay. Well, this is encouraging. Thank you for that feedback. We have less than 1% who are now responding very little. And in the pre-poll, we had 9.5%. We have just under 20% who are recording to some extent. That was 36% in the pre-poll. And then we have, let me do the maths quickly, 79% in the well or very well. And we had 54% across those two categories in the pre-poll. So we seem to have made a difference. Thank you for that feedback. It's very encouraging. Thank you for also paying attention in what has been a fairly dense topic. We will be talking with you further through the subsequent webinars that I've already mentioned. Anthony's talked about the resources that we have available already online and the further work that we're going to do in that space, including in our aged care learning information solution, Alice, which is an education platform. Stay tuned for the further webinars that we are offering. Sign up for them the minute you see them coming online, and we will provide you with further content. And keep an eye on our website as we go forward, because there will be new content there as you send in your questions and we respond to them through the publication of the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. They were really good questions, which showed how closely you were paying attention. My thanks also to the panelists, Anne, Melanie and Anthony, for joining me today and doing such a great job in stepping you through some of that detail. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website, and so you can share it with your colleagues, watch it again if you want. I do hope, along with my colleagues, that you found this webinar informative and useful. Please stay online. If you haven't already completed the survey, stay online and fill it in for us. In addition to the pre and post poll results, it's great for us to get your feedback on how we can improve these sessions and make them even more relevant to your particular information needs. And I look forward to talking with you again at our next webinar, which is not too far away. Thank you, everyone.